Director of National Security Program at the TIF. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Subhranshu. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So after that wonderfully vibrant and enlightening session, we move on to session 2, and we have an equally stellar panel in session 2, comprising of General Vinod Khandare, Dr. Meena Singh Roy, and Dr. Oshrit Birvadker. Unfortunately, Dr. Manish Dabade will not be able to join us in this session. He has an extremely bad sore throat and is slightly feverish, though he's with us in the session, but he will not be able to speak. So we take this opportunity of using those 8 to 10 minutes of Dr. Dabade for the remaining speakers. So I request all the speakers, instead of the allotted 8 to 10 minutes of opening remarks that you have, now you will have about 10 to 11 minutes for the opening remarks. And then an equally, an additional couple of for the question and answer session. Session 2 is a corollary of session 1, in the sense that we take the Indo-Israel partnership forward. As you all know, this entire symposium has been organized to commemorate the 30 years of establishment of diplomatic ties between India and Israel. And the two organizations, the Indian Futures and the Jerusalem Institute of Strategy and Security, brings together experts who specialize in various aspects, like defense. Like today on our panel, we have General Vinod Khandare, who specializes in defense, Dr. Mina Singh Roy in foreign policy and West Asian affairs, and Dr. Oshrit, again on West Asia and the India-Israel relations. So I request each of the speakers to kindly limit their opening remarks to about 10 minutes, to be precise. I think that should be enough stimulant for our audience to even come up with questions. So we begin with General Vinod Khandare, who's retired as the Lieutenant General from the Indian Army, and he served as the military advisor to the National Security Council Secretariat. He's currently the advisor on defense affairs to the government of India. General Khandare, as we have seen in the previous sessions, as well as the opening remarks of Ambassador Noah, India and Israel share some common, we have a common ground in terms of defense and the handling of terrorism. So these happen to be very important aspects. Like, for instance, both the countries have had a long history of dealing with terrorism on their soil. And as already mentioned in the previous sessions, that Israel happens to be the second largest supplier of defense equipment to India after Russia. So this is a very important common ground that both the countries share. And as is well known, Israel has a very robust defense systems, which we have seen in various, especially when it's dealing with Hamas and the Palestinian affair. So I look forward to your comments on India and Israel, because this session basically focuses on the possibilities and of India-Israel relationship moving ahead. We are actually looking at a roadmap for a more engaged, a more robust engagement between the two countries. So I request you to kindly, with your experience and expertise, speak on how India and Israel, especially on the defense platform, how we can cooperate, defense, terrorism, and dealing with radical Islam. Probably this can be the focus of your talk, and I'm sure there are aspects of defense procurement, of defense modernization, of technology transfers, and the whole gamut of issues on defense-related matters that you can highlight. Look forward to your floors. Over to you.
Thank you, Aayushi, and grateful to you for giving additional time, because invariably we always fall short of time, but I assure you I'm not going to take even a minute extra. So, and I'm particularly happy to see His Excellency the Ambassador here, And let me start by saying that both the countries and both the militaries have faced similar challenges right from the time that we became independent. If you, instead of just restricting ourselves to terrorism, let me start and recount how India immediately on becoming independent had to face a conventional war, which was packaged as something which was what happened in Jammu and Kashmir from the other side, while they were called as tribesmen, but actually they were the Pak military. So we faced a conventional threat even before our military had been organized well. Same is the case with Israel. The moment they were born, they were attacked from all sides. And that meant that both of us faced a kind of threat, existential threat from our immediate neighborhood. The second thing, these initially launched conventional wars did not stop. They got repeated again and again. India and Israel both ensured that we built our capabilities from a scratch and we created our own military. But in our respective troubled neighborhoods, we faced our adversaries who not only employed their own militaries, but did not feel shy of using mercenaries. And the kind of conventional conflict suddenly found people from other militaries joining hand. I can specifically mention that when Israel got attacked, the air forces in the neighborhood had Pakistani Air Force pilots flying their aircrafts. Now, what kind of a threat is this? So, we both faced similar threats in conventional conflict. The other thing we find in terrorism, similar threats, it did not stop only at terrorism, it went on to agitational dynamics also. And that is the kind of threat even today we face, and that is where radical Islam or separatism comes in. So additional agitational dynamics, what Intifada did in your part of the world, and we saw similar use of stones as a weapon being perpetrated, and then the kind of threat of human rights. So again, that was one more threat that we faced. I am not wanting to limit this discussion only to a vendor-consumer relationship. While Aayushi, you did highlight that we depend a lot on Israel in terms of defense production, defense products, sales, acquisitions. We also depend on them largely on the technology. Everyone knows that Israel has a technology, state of the art, and we have been cooperating with Israel to a large extent. We have been looking at a lot of training opportunities right at the highest military level, which is the highest course, that is the NDC, and downwards to many courses that we have engaged in. The moment you talk of the highest level means the senior leadership in the respective militaries do impact on each other as to how we tackle these problems which are of daily nature, but even a tactical mistake can have strategic implications. That's exactly what Israel and India both share. We've had a building up of confidence by having senior officers visits and kind of interaction. I have personally benefited from my interaction with senior officers in Israel, and we've been able to understand each other. And very importantly is an aspect of military intelligence and military information. A lot of people may think that military intelligence is the real-time intelligence. It's not so. When we talk of military information sharing, that is related to a large amount of experience sharing, lessons that are learned. So that is again very important for us being a professional military to share each other's experience. Now that is what I have said about the past. But when we talk of strategic partnership, we have to understand what is the real meaning for both the countries. We have a shared vision. We both want our troubled neighborhoods to subside to a level of calmness where we are able to prosper. We must have a stable neighborhood, which obviously we have not inherited in both the cases, but we want a stable neighborhood so that we can economically develop, which essentially means at the highest level, we want a conflict avoidance as well as conflict prevention. Both have managed conflict, or rather conflict management has been the hallmark of the security establishments in both the countries. But finally, both the countries are looking at conflict resolution, and that is not in our hands. That is equally the responsibility of the neighborhood. But we have identified adversaries, at least on two of our fronts. And that is another thing which we very closely watch Israel as to how do they handle the multi-front threats. And we have already said that we have a two-front threat. So we look at that part very closely. And this is with a lot of wisdom. This is with a lot of maturity, because basically Israel and India both have a very deep historical and civilizational connect. So we both have a very rich thought process. So we look at that strategic vision, strategic values, interests, and a strategic future with a shared kind of convergence. And we both have so far survived well in a hostile neighborhood. And I think we will do well to intensify our engagements, not only from buying and selling, but getting more professional. Aayushi, I think I've used my 10 minutes and I can discuss more later.
Thank you so much, sir. That's one of the best things about having a defense personnel on board as a lecturer. The timing is absolutely impeccable. Thank you so much. You have clearly mentioned some very important points, which definitely comes from the ground realities that you have faced. And the important part which you've mentioned here, you've highlighted clearly that we have moved from conflict management to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. So that is a very important, change in position that both the countries are going through. So thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be many more questions coming up in the question and answer sessions. Now I move to the second speaker of the session, Dr. Meena Singh Roy. Dr. Roy is one of the most distinguished scholars on West Asia and India. And undoubtedly, we are going to be benefited with her insights on the issue of foreign policy. Especially, she'll be touching upon a lot of foreign policy issues in her talk today. And with India and Israel, sharing a very long history of nation building, I'm sure it'll be interesting to know how their foreign policy goes through this, the past, the present, and the future. So there is that element of continuity and change, and especially the post-Modi era, and in the previous Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Modi shared a wonderful rapport, and there were a whole lot of elements which scholars would call as dehyphenated foreign policy of India. And clearly that dehyphenation has led to a lot of new aspects to be explored between the two countries. And of course, then there is the common element of United States, the common factor that both the countries are engaging with. So I'm sure, Dr. Meena Singh Roy has a lot of insights on India and Israel relations, especially looking from the prism of foreign policy of both the countries. Look forward to your talk, Dr. Meena Singh. Over to you.
Thank you, Aayushi. And I think probably today I missed the first session thinking, that it is starting at 6 o'clock, and I missed the first session. So my apologies for that, and my compliments to Manish and the team for doing this very timely event. As far as foreign policy is concerned, I think it's a very, very dynamic, thing which has to adapt and, to the new situations which are unfolding. And I think India has been doing pretty well in terms of whether we call it hedging, whether we call it the developmental partnership, whether we call it a strategic partnership. And when we talk about India-Israel relations, I think I see this relationship is a very unique in its nature. Number one, it is truly a strategic partnership. And when I say it is truly strategic partnership, I really mean that there are various, determinants, there are various factors, which actually, tell you that in each and every respect, it is strategic in real sense. And I think that is the uniqueness of India-Israel partnership, a partnership which understands each other's sensitivity, a partnership which doesn't demand anything, and I think a partnership which has delivered in the critical times. So when we talk about foreign policy, and I think particularly after Prime Minister Modi's new dynamic West Asia policy, placing Israel in it, and also, dehyphenating, as you said, Aayushi, I think that made a lot of difference. It made difference in terms of the expectation and the delivery. It made difference in terms of, initiating a truly strategic partnership in real sense and making it very clear, look, this is what we mean. We are not building this partnership, at somebody's cost. The national interest of a country has been a priority when we're talking about the bilateral relationship. But I think from 2014 till now also, and much before that, foreign policy and bilateral relationship have also, driven by perceptions and the realities, and how, the people in the country, the people-to-people contact make a lot of difference. Let me talk about few factors which really make this partnership strategic. First, if we look at the historical connect, which makes the strategic partnership real, I think this is one where we do feel connected. And I'm saying it not only what I've read, but what I have felt being there in Israel. And I think this connect is something which is very natural and flawless. You can only feel it when you are there. And this is, I think, the beauty of the partnership. The second factor which is important is the trust. And India and Israel, I think, have, trust, which drives, our partnership at the level of calling it really strategic. The third aspect is the political will. And when we look at the leadership level, we see the political will at both ends, despite, some differences on certain issues. The political will, in each country is driving this partnership. As I said, the personality factors, to which Aayushi, you also mentioned. Prime Minister Modi's own aura and personality, which, has created a new, I would say, image of India when we talk about the foreign policy issues. I think the role of the leadership makes a lot of difference. And when we talk about India-Israel bilateral relations, I think this is the driving factor. And it's an extremely positive, dynamic, relationship that you see, with the topmost leader of both the countries wanting to take it to a greater heights. Then, comes the common understanding on the strategic matters. And as I said, this is also one factor. You don't have any negative marks on each point or the factor that I'm talking about. And I think there is a common understanding when we talk about these strategic matters. as I said, cooperation during the critical times when we needed, I'm saying whether it is the support or in terms of, providing the defense equipments, which, the Indian Armed Forces have needed. General Khandare would probably say something more on it. But from my point of view, when India needed, in a situation when we needed the weapons, Israel was there to help us. So this, I would say, is one important component of our, strategic partnership. Last but not least is the political system, which is both the countries are democratic countries, and I think that makes this relationship so dynamic and so important. There are various pillars, which I'm sure some of it must have been discussed in the previous session, which I missed, I guess. Defense, of course, continues to be an important pillar, but India-Israel relations have gone beyond defense cooperation today. Whether we talk about agriculture, whether we talk about science and technology, whether we talk about economic and trade partnership. So there are enough, sort of practically proven examples of the building partnership that we see. I don't think there is enough time to get into the details of it, but I would like to touch upon the cultural and education, which I think, is somewhat, there is much more that we can do on this. And the other point, there are a few recommendations that I have when you're looking at the future, areas that could be, looked at. When we're talking about culture and education, in 2020, both the countries, linked a cultural agreement. They signed a cultural agreement that delineated a 3-year program of cooperation. And I think now is the right time where there is a greater understanding about, Israeli people. I mean, they've been coming here. The youth has been coming here. The warmth, one can always feel it. So one has to look at what can we do in this particular section. And I think here, the youth and women should be the driving force when we talk about the cultural cooperation. And when I'm saying about this, I feel there need to be certain workshops by women scientists, by women journalists, by women artists, IT professionals, doctors. And this, this is how, this could be done at the track 2 level, but various, and here I'm specifically talking about the women, force, which are very, very active, which are very, very dynamic in both the countries. So I think the some sort of a joint workshop can be thought about, bringing in the women as such, into interacting with each other. This could be an yearly, kind of a workshop that can be done. There could also be, some kind of a joint project on culture, on the cultural symposiums, we could. And this is where it could be at the college level, it could be at the school level, and it could be at the common, theaters, or any aspect of the culture that you pick up, you can talk about it. We have enough strong ties when we talk about defense, agriculture, but I think now is the time to push, this people-to-people contact. There could be, language is a very, very important aspect of building a relationship between two countries. And I think this is where, specifically designed workshop for the youth on the learning the languages, is something which should be a priority for us if we are thinking about the future engagement with the country in a much more meaningful way. And here, I think language and literature, these are extremely important component of any culture of a country. And we need to look at the translation of the rich literary work from both the sides. This is something which can be initiated in the universities, in the think tanks, and there should be some regular programs that we can think of. When we talk about the India-Israel cooperation, just not the bilateral, I did hear, we talked about the trilateral or multilateral cooperation, but I think there's huge potential on the new technologies that we can think about, innovation, startups, the quantum, sort of technology, quantum science, blockchain, 3D printing. These are some of the very important areas where India, US, UAE, Israel, they can work together. I would say, in fact, India, Israel, and Morocco can also work. Food security is an extremely important area where, there can be a very, very meaningful cooperation, whether it is trilateral, whether it is quadrilateral. This is something which is going to be the future of the engagement between the countries. And this is something which we are going to see, which is already visible in the post-Ukraine crisis as to how, this has been affected. Renewable energy. This is the other important, I think, areas which we need to think about when we are talking of taking our bilateral relationship to a different level. And how many minutes do I have more? Few more minutes?
Another minute or two to wrap up.
Okay, all right. So now let us come to the Bollywood, the film industry, the media. And this has a huge currency. You could have, I have seen that's a small country, but it's such a beautiful country. There could be so much of connection in terms of the musicians, the artists, and the film industry, which can easily, go and do their shootings. And I think there can be a joint film production by both the filmmakers of the countries. That is one. Disaster management, I think, is one point which I probably would like to emphasize when we're talking about the bilateral, trilateral cooperation. And there's a huge potential, I would say, because, as I said, each factor which makes your relationship strategic is a win-win situation for both the countries. And that's where, one can think about, working jointly in a third country. And this is probably what would be the future of India-Israel relations in coming years. So I think counterterrorism, and I'm sure a lot of other issues have already been talked about. So I thought I would just focus on this. We know, Israel can contribute in a big way when we are talking about Make in India to Make for World in terms of joint production. So I think areas are numerous. There's no end to the cooperation that we can think about with the countries. But I think youth and women are the driving force when we look at the future engagement between the two countries. And we need to look regionally. It's just not the bilateral, but beyond bilateral is what we need to look at. And I think I'm going to stop here, Aayushi, and I'll take more during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meena. That really, you gave a very vast canvas to us. And I'm sure that canvas is going to be our painting ground when in the question and answer session. So there were a whole lot of issues that you touched upon. And that also brings us, it's a very organic transition to the last speaker, who will be speaking on trade and culture. So we have with us Dr. Oshrit Birvadker, and she calls herself, she's an expert at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and she calls herself a proud Indian Jewish. So over to you, Dr. Oshrit. Look forward to hearing you out.
All right.
I guess you
Hello,
have
everyone.
I'm sorry. I think you have a presentation to share. So might be we can ask in case you have to share anything.
No, I don't have a presentation.
Okay.
I just need your attention, not a presentation. Anyway,
yeah.
So I'm Dr. Oshrit Birvadker from TIF-JISS, joining you from Bombay. And today I'm going to speak shortly about the trade prospects and a bit about the importance of cultivating cultural ties between India and Israel. So if you look at it, since the establishment of full diplomatic relations in 1992, there has been a gradual increase in the volume of trade between both countries, from $200 million to $5 million in 2021. And we know that defense exports are now estimated at $1.5 billion this year. And India is Israel's third trading partner, and as you may know, and Israel's seventh in the world. But for decades, the trade focused mainly on diamonds and chemicals. And in recent years, it has expanded to high-tech and communication system, medical equipment, and advanced agriculture technology. However, the trade potential is far from being maximized from both sides. And the Indian economy could become a major destination in the future for Israeli exports, especially as the purchasing power of 300 million middle class and upper class citizens competing the purchasing power of the middle class in the Western economies. On February 1st this year, India Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the 2022 economic survey. As we know, the survey is considered one of the most important documents in the Indian politics because its conclusion is said to dictate the budget framework for next year. But this survey actually predicted the Indian GDP is expected to grow by 8% in 2023. While the IMF forecast expect an increase of 9%. So with these positive forecasts for the Indian economy, I want to point on a few fields and aspects that can affect the trade relations between both countries. The pillar of India-Israel relation is, of course, defense, although the ambit of defense cooperation has widened more recently. Israeli arms sales to India continue to be the cornerstone of the bilateral relations. But yet India's ambition to achieve self-reliance in terms of defense productions. And here I think it's important that we should change our perspective, our point of view. The fear should not be that in the long run, we will sell less to India and the Indian will not need us. The modernization of the defense industry has a long way to go. But the question we Israelis should ask ourselves is how we participate in the process of building the Indian superpower. And for several years, the Indian Ministry of Defense has been trying to implement the Make in India program in the field of defense production. However, the development in the defense production remained quite slow, and the local industry has difficulties in producing, good quality equipment and weapons. But the recent refinements, the Ministry of Defense announced in the middle of the first wave of the COVID wave, allowed the increase of foreign investment from 49 to 74%. And what they call the automatic route. And this decision is intended to increase the involvement of the private sector in the domestic defense production. So despite the concern that such move may affect the defense export and trade between India and Israel, Israel may also benefit from strengthening India's defense manufacturing industries and capabilities. The foothold, I think, in the Indian market and the existence of large-scale production infrastructure may help Israel leverage and increase the profit from production in India, mainly thanks to the competitive prices that the Indians will offer. India has highly competitive wage rate ratio, as well as high availability of skilled manpower. And across the country, we can find about 6,000 functioning technical and engineering institute with 2.5 million of students enrolled annually in these institutes and available for work. And as we know, the defense sector, by the way, is like strategic sector in the Indian economy, if you understand, because due to the fact of its potential in job creation, and a matter that the Indian economy is struggling and will probably struggle in the future. So the collaboration in local production is an extraordinary opportunity to support the Indian economy and deepen the strategic alliance between Delhi and Jerusalem. Israel has always been the no question asked supplier. It transfers even its most advanced technology without setting placing any limits to its supporting India. So I think supporting India's aspiration in self-reliance in defense actually has no difference. Another field, interesting aspect of trade could be assist India's development in cooperation of health and medicines. In December 2020, India and Israel signed an agreement on cooperation in this field. The agreement goal was deepening to the strategic partnership in health sector, including the R&D in health. So COVID times are a prime example, actually, of the possibilities of cooperation between both countries. The dramatic increase we saw in the numbers of people positive to COVID in India has rekindled the debate over the shortage of medical services across the country. So in the field of disease treatment, for example, I think India and Israel can collaborate in developing capabilities and cooperate in what we call the digital healthcare. In the last decades, many countries have engraved this leading public health system into this digital age to improve, of course, the medical services and adapt them to the future trends. And India's experience in the field of health has provoked mixed reactions from experts from India and outside India. And India still lacks adequate health infrastructure, especially in non-urban areas. So if we look in Israel, Israel has succeeded in establishing an advanced healthcare system. So following the criticism that the Indian government faced during the pandemic, I think that Indians are interested in rapid changes when it comes to in these fields. And the adoptions of India's digital tools system in healthcare is still in its fancy. So choosing the right partner may speed up the Indian process. Another field is of course, food technology and agriculture. I think it's an interesting platform that both countries are already cooperating in this field, but there's a long way to go. Israel is one of the leading countries in the field of food technology and is ranked high in the world in terms of the ability to provide sophisticated technological solution to deal with the challenge of the whole food supply chain. So the range of innovation capabilities in the field of agri-tech in general and food tech in Israel actually wide. It's varied and includes sensors in soil and planets and new UAVs and some autonomous robots, culture meat, alternative proteins as well, but also big data analysis software when it comes to agriculture. And this is something that I think India needs more because of its size. So in India, agriculture, we know, accounts for 70% of its GDP. India still has many challenges, such as the small plots of Indian farmers, excessive use of chemicals, inefficient use of water, and limited access to credit and insurance. So Israel can provide solutions to local agriculture and increase the profitability, because this is one of the main problems when it comes to agriculture and the local agriculture. So India can become also an experimental field for Israeli technology because of its size in the field of agriculture. Multilateral platform actually is another key to boost the trade. The geopolitical shift in the Middle East may have an effect on the expansion of trade relations between India and Israel. The Abraham Accords opened the window for trade between India and the Persian Gulf. On October last year, an official statement issued on behalf of the Israeli embassy, India, UAE as well, on a common vision on this subject. So if we look at the numbers, the trade between Israel and India is about 5 billion. We said trade between Israel and UAE is 1 billion. But if we look at the numbers, the trade between India and UAE is approximately $60 billion. And now they're talking about double the number in the next few years. So if you analyze the data, economic triangle is a required step. And in this framework, India will provide technology, Emirates will make sure that the capital will flow to the project and be available for them. And India will provide manufacturing infrastructure, skilled and cheap manpower. India may also advance its commercial capabilities by adopting the India-Arab Med corridor. I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but this corridor actually is expected to shorten the transport time of goods from Mumbai to Europe through Israel, through Greece by 7 days. And a broader framework in the form of regional groups will allow India to enjoy Israel status in the Mediterranean basin as well, but it will also allow to advance its economic interest in the Eastern Mediterranean basin. The new Middle Eastern Quad you mentioned earlier is another platform to expand economic ties. If you look at this new Quad, it is not admittedly a strategic grouping yet. It is restricted of being an international forum for economic cooperation with focus on exploring, emphasizing, and ultimately channelizing the unique capability of each country into a joint working group. So this is another example. But the main economic indicator to improve trade relation is actually a significant increase in the volume of trade between both countries, the level of investment between the two countries, the number of Indian companies operating in Israel, and the number of Israeli companies operating in India. But the key to further development of this and maximizing the potential lies in easing the activities of Israeli companies in India. And and the other way. And one example could be in the field of issuing visas for professionals. Easing the activity can be done in many ways. It can be by adopting the double tax treaty, adopting visa policy, easing the transfer of capital from and to India, and expanding the safety net from both sides, especially when it comes to investment protection. So another way, by the way, is by exempting Israel from many Make in India restrictions. Many governmental companies in India actually request and demand that the equipment supply will be made in India. And it's one of the major problems and concern I hear when I meet people and who want to do business with India. This is one of the problems. And I think it's possible that the Israeli product will be acceptable for these needs. Perhaps the celebration of the 30th anniversary, it's a good momentum to promote such move. In the United States, for example, there's a similar idea called the Buy American Act, and Israeli products are considered under this category in addition to Americans. So this is about trade. I cover a bit about trade. I want to speak about culture because Dr. Roy was mentioning it earlier, and I want to speak about it in my lecture as well, but I don't know how much time I have. But I'll start with the fact that understanding the culture can help to boost the economic ties as well. And it's very important because cultural relations are about building long-term trust-based relationship. Trust is fundamental to security in the world. And there's a vocabulary of trust that is intergovernmental, treaties, securities, commitment, and so on. But states don't have friends. Internationally, trust exists where it exists at all between people, where raison d'etat doesn't hold sway. So there are many ways to enhance cultural relations. And today, Dr. Roy mentioned a few, but today I'm going to speak about tourism and diaspora. We were discussing earlier about the trade relations, and the research shows that the degree of trade openness was positively correlated with international tourism demand. So tourism as a service industry plays an important role, of course, in the development of many countries and has been expanding significantly in recent years. It actually, what happened is that this expansion subsequently yielded several benefits for businesses such as hotel, travel agencies, restaurants, and these businesses attract actually foreign money, foreign currency, and generate incomes that is distributed across the country. But if we analyze the data when it comes to India, Israel, we can see that the tourist arrivals to India from Israel have doubled over the last 15 years, including thousands of Israelis visiting after the compulsory service. So tourism and people-to-people contact have been giving a major boost with the commencement of the Air India flight in March 2018, between New Delhi and Tel Aviv, with 5 flights per week, reduced to 2 flights per week during COVID. I think now they're back to 3. El Al used to operate direct flights between Mumbai and Tel Aviv, and Israeli Arkia airline used to have some flights to Goa and Kerala. But unfortunately, these companies canceled their flight during COVID, during the pandemic, and they have not returned to full operation. And it's extremely important to change that. And on this note, I want to point, I personally think that it's a huge mistake to cancel Air India flights on Saturday. We cannot allow religion to affect business and harm the rights of the rest of the people in the name of few. But back to India. India, as we know, has all the ingredients to become one of the world's premier tourism destination. Geographically, India is perfectly positioned between the emerging East and the wealthiest West. India has large English-speaking population, diverse heritage with almost 40 UNESCO-listed sites, attractive climate, unique wildlife, and of course, our popular national cuisine. So as we can see, India has a huge tourism potential. And if it was capitalized properly, it can emerge as one of the leading sectors to contribute to the country's GDP, and also the potential to augment employment. But lack of proper infrastructure coupled with lack of awareness and willpower to act as a major roadblockers, deterring the desire to success in this sector. But the pandemic also caused conspicuous losses in this sector, since the economy is recuperating. If proper measures are implemented officially, it can reshape the Indian tourism sector as well. But if we look at the numbers, like pre-COVID in 2018, India's international tourists and non-resident Indian arrivals stood at 18 million. if we look at the Israeli side, according to a survey conducted by Travelist website, which examines Israeli flight habit over the past decades, it was found that about 70% of Israelis increased the number of flights abroad as a result of the open sky reform. And in the next decade, we should expect opening more flights and more lines to and from Israel, and Ben Gurion Airport is already preparing for its expansions. But when we look at the characteristic of both countries, I would say that for Israel, India is an important tourism market because of its size. And for India, I would say that the main goal in encouraging Israeli tourism to India is first and foremost to strengthen the soft power of India in Israel. So despite the flourishing relationship and the prosperous relationship between India and Israel, most of Israelis consider India as a third world country. And I still come across like comments like, oh, India, I don't have any intentions to visit there. What I have to see there, it's only poverty. Like poverty doesn't exist in other countries they visit, in South America or in Morocco. So there is a huge gap between how the intellectual elite perceive India and the common people. So while the perception on India has changed, even in the most conservative countries in the Middle East, for example, I think that Israel is still lagging behind. And the Indian government should allocate the appropriate budget for changing this perception of India among Israelis. And of course, tourism is just one way of doing it. Unfortunately, both countries still far from reaching their tourism potential. And I think one of the things that can be done is, for example, canceling the visa fees for Indians, tourists traveling in groups, or give some visa extensions for Indian passport holder, like it was done to the Chinese, for the Chinese citizens. This is another ways to do it. Diaspora is another way which could influence the cultural ties between India and Israel. The diaspora is very special to India, residing in distant lands. Its members have retained their emotional, cultural, and spiritual links with the country. And diaspora are political and culture bridges between two countries. They are the de facto culture ambassador of their homelands in the host countries, and the host countries in their homelands. And currently, there are approximately 85,000 Jews of Indian origin in Israel, and the main wave of immigration into Israel took place in the 50s and 60s. The majority are from Maharashtra, where I'm coming from, the Bnei Israelis, but there are other groups. But as we see, the prosperous relations between India and Israel in the last few years had an impact on the community as well. And Narendra Modi's visit to Israel in 2017 increased the community's publicity. Right now, we're witnessing a great momentum, I think, in the history of the Indian diaspora in Israel. We're witnessing a major activity in social media platform. We can see this in the increase in the number of diaspora organizations, in the number of activities such as conferences and events organized by the diaspora and for the diaspora in the last 4 years. So we know that since the 2000s, the government of India has undergone institutional and conceptual change in which the diaspora is become part of the tool of the Indian foreign policy. So the Indian community in Israel, compared to other communities, is relatively small. But it's not, I think it's not about the size, it's more about the strength of the community and their status in the Israeli society. And the growing partnership between India and Israel should serve as an incentive to encourage, for example, research on the histories and culture of Indian Jews. Such research would not only add to the understanding of the immigrant experience in Israel, but it will also shed some light on understanding how culture, religious, and national identities are taking shape across these two nations. When it comes to diaspora and and its role as a culture agency, I guess, I want to give you one recent example about the Indian cuisine, actually. I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but if you ever tried to get a proper Indian food in Israel, anywhere, it's probably impossible mission if you want to order it for home or you want to order it to work. So compared to the rest of the world, Indian food hasn't become popular kitchen in Israel, and it's still not. But the few restaurants, they have their own unique clientele. The rest of the Israelis were keeping their distance from it. But one reality show recently, when an Indian origin participant who made it to the finals unconsciously have helped to prove the Indian food image in Israel in a way that was never done before. So after the show, and while the show was broadcasted, people became curious about the Indian cuisine, the Indian food, and were more open to try it. We could see it in analyzing the number of engagements on social media, but it also became the interesting chat the next day in the office. So this is just another example of how the people of Indian origin can be India's best ambassadors. So with this positive change, I leave you, and I think I'm done.
Thank you so much. I just didn't want to interrupt you, but I was just, that's a very extensive presentation. And in fact, you have also answered a question that has come to us on similar lines. In fact, the question was on Indian diaspora, the role of Indian diaspora in Israel. And you've said that extensively. Probably you are one of our best ambassadors, being one yourself. And we're fortunate to have you there in that place. I'm sure people like you can weave a new narrative, the narrative of an aspirational India, the narrative of a progressive India, and one that is progressing not just for itself, but for the entire global order, for a positive global world order, which is rule-based, which is ethical. So thank you so much, Dr. Oshrit, for it. Yes, the questions now for the speakers. So you've received quite a lot of questions, General Khandare, because as you see, when you talk of India-Israel relations, one of the most prominent thing that comes about is on the issue of defense. But one thing that you raised, and the question is regarding this, you've spoken about resolution, conflict resolution, and the role of the other party in terms of conflict resolution. You see, both India and Israel have issues that they are grappling with, where probably the other party is not interested in a resolution. In terms of India, if we have Pakistan, there you have the Palestinian issue, which is a long-standing issue with that Israel is grappling with. So in such a scenario, how do you see a resolution actually coming about? Do you see that as a possibility, or do you see only defense as a means of resolving the problem? And the second question that has risen, sir, which again is for General Khandare, is the role of intelligence sharing, both military and non-military intelligence sharing, because we have a lot to learn from Israel on this in this regard. So, the question that one of the audience has asked, one of the student, in fact, he's a student who has asked us, what do you feel that the role of intelligence sharing is, and what can we learn from the Israel experience? Because clearly Israel has a very strong record when it comes to intelligence gathering and intelligence aspects, whether it's Mossad or whatever. So how do you see, where all can India learn from it? Dr. Meena, the question to you is about the possibility of a West Asian Quad and what would be India's role in it. What do you see? What are the possibilities and the blueprint of such a organization coming into place? Because clearly the existing Quad, America, Japan, India, and Australia seems to have its own plus and minuses. So where do you see a West Asia Quad going? How do you see? How strong will it be, and what is it? This is especially keeping in mind having the base as the fact that trust and political will are very strong. So in that scenario, where do you see this going? And also your comments on green energy, the possibility of green energy. And the third question to you is regarding technology. You said in your presentation, you mentioned how important, technology can be one aspect where India and Israel cooperate. There's a lot of prospects for cooperation in that, whether it's in terms of health or defense technology, non-defense technology. But how do you see the US factor impacting technology transfer? Because clearly US is not very positive on this issue, and Israel being a close, having close engagements with the US, do you see this coming as an impediment in the way of India and Israel technology transfer? So that's for you. And yes, can we begin with General Khandare, please?
Yeah, thank you, Aayushi. Firstly, when I look at conflict resolution, I mentioned that, let me reiterate, when you are in a neighborhood, the way both the countries are, you've not been, you don't have the advantage of choosing your neighbors, nor can you mold their attitudes in a jiffy. Conflicts normally take generations together to get resolved. So there is no quick fix solution unless you reach a position of ascendancy where you can leverage your national power and get your neighbors to yield to your viewpoint. And I think that's where Israel has proven a point. You look at its neighborhood from what it was in the late 1940s and where they have traveled all this in this entire journey. They've been able to, in a way, splinter the kind of unity that had forged when Israel came into existence. And they wanted to just destroy Israel and wipe it off the face of this earth. But what Israel has been able to achieve is spectacular. They've been able to now get into an Abrahamic accord, and now you have the Arab world in two or multiple camps. To a large extent, it is because of the perseverance, it is because of the comprehensive national power that Israel was able to build up and generate a kind of leverage over some of the neighbors who were in a very weak spot, or they were dependent on Israel. So I think that is a major lesson for all of us to learn in this part of the world. How quickly can a conflict be resolved? It depends on your power, your capability, your strategic behavior, and also the neighborhood and how quickly you can make them weak. So that is one part I want to say. Secondly, about the intelligence sharing. Now, intelligence is one aspect is the military intelligence, and there is another aspect which is the non-military intelligence. Israel has proved that it is good on both counts. And while we all acknowledge that Israel's intelligence agencies are everyone knows them, everyone knows what they've been able to achieve. This is not a forum where we will be able to share with you as to what is our cooperation with Israel in terms of military intelligence. There's tremendous amount of cooperation which happens, and it is to the credit of both the nations that this does not come out in public domain, because once that comes out, I think the entire value of intelligence sharing would be lost. I want to specifically stress on one more aspect. What is the reason that the quality of intelligence in Israel is of such a high order? There are two reasons I would assign to this. Firstly, is the way they have the culture of conscription. Every individual, every youth goes through that learning curve and understands what is extremely important for Israel as a nation. And even after they've stepped out of uniform, they know 24/7 what they have to do in case they notice something abnormal. Whether he is driving a car, whether he's driving a taxi, whether he's just somebody in a kibbutz, but they know exactly what is to be reported when and where. I think that's a very important point that has contributed to the strategic culture and the strategic behavior of the whole of nation approach of Israel. Now, we don't find ourselves in that particular spot. We have a long journey to cover, and I'm not advocating that we just follow what Israel has been doing. We have to find our own solutions, and that is where the awareness among the citizens is extremely important. I think for Israel, it was a compulsion. Seeing the kind of environment that is developing in India, or that we have been facing externally and internally, I think we will come to such a situation where intelligence will mature. The systems and the good practices from Israel, we will have to adopt. Quite a few we've adopted. But when it comes to common citizens, there's a long way to go.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Meena.
Thank you, Aayushi. I think I was expecting this question on new Middle East Code or, nomenclatures can be different. But the bottom line here is, as you also mentioned, the issue is of trust and political will. And the third dimension, which we forget, is how beneficial it is for everybody. We are going to see a completely new situation develop in the post-Ukraine crisis. How it gets resolved. Are we going to see a new economic order in future? We don't know. There are a lot of uncertainties which are going to be affecting, your decisions. But I am very sort of positive about, particularly, when it comes to India, Israel, UAE, including Saudi Arabia, I would say. As far as the United States is concerned, yes, there could be some resistance. Nothing comes free. But when it comes to the larger, benefit of each country which is involved, and here comes the related question of the technology, one could think about something which is specially crafted and customized, for the benefit of the 4 countries. Now, I'm sure there are many ways that one can sit and discuss. These are few issues. Nobody gives you, their own earnings, that is not going to happen. But something which is beneficial for each member of the court, or even if we are talking about a trilateral or a bilateral, cooperation in terms of technology or in terms of, many other areas, banking, fintech, you name an area where there are so many openings for each country. So there would be challenges, there would be negotiations, and nothing comes free, as I said. But I see a lot of compatibility, amongst the actors that we are talking about, whether we call it a new Quad or we call it a quadrilateral or trilateral or minilateral cooperation. So there are common grounds where I think there would be willingness amongst the actors to work collectively. And I think one such example is already where India, UAE, and Israel are, party to the solar panels, which are being, with need just special cleaning, sort of a brush that is being produced, so there is an existing cooperation. So I think despite the challenges which we might see or the differences, there would be a common ground for cooperation amongst the 3 countries or 4 countries. That is one. On the green energy, I think this is the future for each country. You cannot, but you have to work together when we talk about the disasters which are happening, the climate change issues, and even the demand factor will push you to cooperate. There is no way that you can escape this. And food security becomes a part of it. And we see how UAE's new strategy, which has been announced and which is already in process. So there is so much for India, UAE, Israel to work, trilaterally. I would say India, Morocco, and Israel can also work, So there are many opportunities. Nothing will come, but there has to be some give and take. We have, agreements which are planned and executed depending on, what suits an individual country and what is the common demand and what are you willing to give, what are you willing to offer, and how is it going to take. We talk about strategic partners, which means give and take in many ways. So I think I have probably answered, and I'm very sort of positive about the cooperation, what shape and size it will take, whether we say it is a new Quad or not new Quad, but the cooperation is unstoppable. That is what I would say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meena, for that. Now let me play the last role of such a wonderful session and also an entire symposium that was dedicated to India-Israel relations. So on behalf of the Indian Futures and the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, I thank all the speakers. To begin with, I would like to thank His Highness Ambassador Noir for giving the keynote session. and Professor Inbar on behalf of the Jerusalem Institute for making this happen, for helping us scout such wonderful experts. It was a pleasure, sir, for us to do at the Indian Futures, for us to help organize this. I'm sure it's benefited an entire audience comprising of experts and students who work on various aspects of India-Israel relations. So once again, my sincere thanks to the eminent speakers comprising of Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Professor Inbar, Professor Kumaraswamy, Dr. Kushnam of Session 1, General Vinod Khandare, Dr. Meena Singh Roy, and Dr. Oshrit of Session 2. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time and being a part of this symposium and giving your wonderful insights, which I'm sure will help a lot of students who have attended this symposium on various platforms, including Facebook. So hope to have a more robust engagement in future as well on various aspects, particularly specific aspects about India-Israel relations. I'm sure there's a lot to be worked upon. There's a lot of possibilities between India-Israel relations to bloom in the coming years, in the coming future, in the near as well as distant future. Thank you all so much once again. And thank you for the audience, which has patiently heard this. And in fact, there are a whole lot of questions which due to the time compulsion, which I wasn't able to ask. But I'm sure these experts will be available to all of us, especially to the community, to share various aspects of their knowledge, their insights, and help India-Israel relations reach the next level. Thank you so much once again. On behalf of TIF and JISS, wish you a wonderful evening. And with this, we